Hi there everybody, this is Chris Schmidt with another Greyscalegorilla tutorial. So, in this video, we are going to be trying to recreate this effect. But enough of that, let's jump on in and see how to make this thing from scratch. Now, I'm actually going to be creating this in R16, but nothing I'm doing requires R16. In fact, all you really need, I think, is your version has to have hair, because we're going to create this using the hair module. So, how are we going to do this? Well, I'm going to start out by creating a plane, and let's make these numbers nice and even. So I'm going to make this plane 1000 by 1000. And so there we go. This is going to be the foundation of everything that we do. What we want to do is drive how many hairs we have based on how many polygons we've given this plane. There might be some slightly different ways to do this, but this one's worked pretty well. Now, I've had really good luck with having about 500 by 500. I get pretty good real-time feedback in the viewport. I'm going to go a little lower than that just for the purposes of this tutorial. And if you were to go 1000 by 1000, it started going pretty slow for me. But 1000 by 1000 literally means you will have 1,000,000 clones on the screen. So I think we had like 800,000 or not 80,000. So I forget the number, but we get a lot, even just with this 400 by 400. So I had to change our view here. You can see we get a lot of polygons, and each one of those is going to become a surface for hair. Why don't we do that right now? I'm going to go ahead and go to Simulate, Hair Objects, Add Hair. So now it's added hair. And how has it added hair? Well, right now, the way it's set, it's added one hair to every vertex. And normally that would be fine, but because we want to kind of map these to be a particular color, we're going to get around that by changing the root from polygon vertex to polygon center. And as soon as I click that, you're going to see that the center of each polygon becomes a hair. And now what's great is, like, these are all guides right now. But you can see that I'm getting pretty good refresh as I rotate my screen. And for all purposes, we have 400 by 400 clones. I want to see what number that is. I'll just make a cube and say 400 times 400. Oh, okay, 160,000. We have 160,000, I'm close, 1,000 clones. So, what do we need to do now? Well, we want to, first of all, we want to make this run as fast as possible. So our guides, because we're going to be doing straight pillars, we don't need any subdivisions. So right here we have segments, and I don't want any segments. I'm going to drop it down. It's probably going to jump to 1, but yeah, so we're going to drop down to 1 segment per. And then we go to hairs here, and this is how many hairs it's going to generate, but we actually don't need those at all. I think we can just zero that out, or actually, I think that what we want to do is set this to as guides, which means each guide becomes 1 hair. So I'm going to turn that on as guides, and that means it turns off count and turns off segments, which means the guides also, or the final hair also has 1 segment. And then, where the magic really comes in is the Generate tab. And in the Generate tab, that is where it's being told to render hairs. But we don't actually want to render hairs. We want to render a whole series of little pillars. So we're going to keep this as light as possible. So I'm going to turn off render hairs, and we got a bunch of options here. And you want to be careful about clicking any of this stuff here. I'm going to keep on pointing out different warnings, but it's really important. Like, you could really easily kind of freeze your computer if you click the wrong thing somewhere, or at least wait a really long time. So I'm going to go ahead and click on square, and now this is actually going to be extruding out an entire series of squares, and this is really important. You see single object, we want to leave that checked on. If you turn that off, bad news. Like, even if I turn it off right now, my computer would probably freeze. And I'm going to turn on end cap, because right now these would be hollow, so I want to end cap. We could turn on start cap, but that would make a polygon seal in the bottom, and that would be a useless polygon. It would just be sitting there, we wouldn't see it, so why add extra polygons? So right now, every single one of these hairs is represented by 5 polygons. And actually, the way that point might be on the top, they might be 8, but in any case, we don't need the start cap. So each of these is an extrusion now, and you'll see that I'm still getting really good feedback. And if I start zooming in here, you're not going to be able to tell too well what we're looking at. But that's because these are incredibly thin right now. These pillars are as thin as the hairs used to be. So that's no good. We control those, though, through our hair material. So if we go to our hair material and we go to thickness, this is how thick they are. So at the base, they're 1, and at the top, they're 0.1, really tiny. I'm not sure what size we need exactly, so I'm going to type in 3 and 3. And we're going to have to wait a second for it to refresh. And I guessed pretty correctly. But now you'll see that we have a size of 3 by 3, and I'm not sure if they're intersecting a little bit. If they are, we'll shrink it just a little. But now look, you can tell that these are a ton of pillars, and look at this refresh rate I'm still getting. We're still getting really good feedback. Now, when we change key numbers, it will take a little while to calculate. But I'm going to set these to 2.5 and 2.5. And now I'm going to wait, because it's got to calculate this, and there we go. Now it's made all of our pillars. And actually, I might even go to 2.4. This is just a guess. I mean, depending on your size, these will be different. But if I go to 2.4, then we should get a little space in between them, and I want that. And you also see that we have a Phong tag on our hair. If we turn on limit angle, or we could just delete the Phong tag, then you'll see that our edges go away and we get nice hard edges. And you'll see that we're still getting really great refresh. Now, the reason we're getting such good refresh with this technique, and why this wouldn't work if we were doing a cloner, is because if you're using a cloner and you put in a cube, then we would actually have 400 by 400 cubes being cloned. But when it comes to using hair, what's happening is the spline object, this hair object, is actually returning, for all purposes, a single spline, even though there's 160,000 parts to it. It's a single spline, and then it's, for all purposes, sweeping one spline. Cinema doesn't like a lot of objects, but doesn't mind a lot of polygons. So as long as this is being treated like one spline, we get really good feedback. All right, let's move on. So I guess the next most important thing is, how do we want this to look? How are we going to make these have all those interesting heights? Well, we're going to do that through the length checkbox inside our hair material, and that's going to be what drives it. As an example, as a test, why don't we go ahead and just put a noise in. So I'm on length, and I'm going to drop in a noise, and I'm going to leave it default, and now I just turn on this checkbox. It's going to take a second, but let's let it refresh, and boom, it's refreshed. Now, I want to deselect it because it's hard to get feedback when you have it selected, because all the hairs are still the same length all the way up to the top. So what I'm actually going to do is grab the hair, lock it right here. Do you see this little lock? If I lock that, then that means I can deselect my object, and I still have the hair object selected here. But now you see it's not selected in the viewport. All right, so there you go. Look, we've got this awesome varying height, and we're still getting just as fast a refresh here. So that's working really well. All right, so that's a noise, and that's really fun. And if you could use any kind of noise you want, you could animate the noise. You could layer a bunch of noises up with the layer shader. And that's actually what I did in the animated version. That's what I did in this kind of, this one is all just a series of layered noises. I probably have like 12 different types of noise all layered on top of each other to make this one. But let's make an image-based one. They're a little more fun. That's what I started out with. Now, if you look at the reference material here, like, it clearly looks like this is like some topographic data maybe, or who knows? I mean, it could be generated in a million different ways, but it kind of looks like topographic data, or maybe pictures of storms, maybe some undersea floor stuff. There's a lot of different options. And what I initially did is I just searched. I went to NASA. If you go to like NASA's website, all of those images are in the public domain, at least if you're a U.S. citizen. Maybe everybody's, I don't know. And all those images are free, so you can like legally use those, because our tax dollars went to pay for all those photos being taken. So when it came to those images, say this one is actually a nebula photo that I took from the NASA website. So what we're doing is I'm using both the height data and the color data to drive it. So there's a lot of different images we can do. But then I started moving on and actually trying to tinker with some of my own photos. So I just went through my photo album, and I tend to take a lot of photos of like just textures and materials and whatnot. So here's some examples of of renders. When I was scrolling through, you saw some of these as renders. And some of them are pretty interesting. Like this picture of cereal is actually this one. This is just a picture of cereal. But the one I thought looked pretty cool was this rusty one. So it's just a rusty pipe. In fact, you can even see it curving around a little bit, but I didn't care too much about that. Now, in Photoshop, the only step that I think is kind of important is find whatever reference image. Go find a galaxy, go find a picture of a solar system, go find some nebulas, find a hurricane, whatever kind of image you want. But there's some important things you do want. What you want is maybe like areas that are similar. You see that we get a lot of these green areas, and then we have distinct other areas. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we have the full spectrum. Well, I guess we want color if you're making a color one, but you want almost everything from white to black. And you'll see in this image that we get these very bright white parts, and these are pretty light here. And then we get black areas. And those that contrast is going to really help with our height map. So I'm going to actually hit Command L. I'm going to go to Levels in Photoshop. I don't know where you find it in the menu. Oh, right here, Levels. But I'm going to hit Command L to go to Levels. And you'll see I've actually already tweaked this a little bit. But if you hadn't tweaked it, actually, where's the image? Like this one. I haven't tweaked this one yet. So if I go to Levels, you'll see this is the spectrum of how bright it is. And let's say I want a little more contrast. I could grab this line and pull it in. And you see that these darks are getting darker. And if I pull this in, we're getting brighter whites. Now, if I go too far, then these areas of white would end up being completely flat. So we don't want to go beyond it. But the image you bring in, I don't know if I have any good... Like, here's my original image. If I go to the levels here, you'll see that there's not a lot going on right here, so I could crop in a little. And this one, there's not a lot going on until about here, so I might crop into about there, so we get the heavy contrast. And the other important detail is... At least the one that we're making is square. So I want to make sure this image is square. So you can hit C, go ahead and crop your image and make sure that you've cropped it to be a square image. That way it's not getting stretched. That's all you have to do. You don't have to worry about the resolution. As long as our resolution is at least as high or higher than what our pillar count is. And right now our pillar count is 400 by 400. And if we were to check out the image size of this one, and we go to pixels... I actually scaled this one to 400 by 400, but you can actually have higher than that. Like I used this image, and this is obviously bigger than 400 by 400, but we're going to deal with that in Cinema. And if you were going to go to a higher resolution, you want to make sure your image is at least as high a resolution. All right, cool. Anyway, here we are in our noise. I'm going to save this file so it can find our textures, and we're just going to save this as #1 tutorial. Cool. Okay, and I'm going to go to our track down an image, and I'm going to grab Rust. And I'm going to say open, and now all I guess I have to do is wait a second for it to figure out the way this should look. So, okay, that's pretty crazy. It's automatically mapped. It automatically maps as if it was flat projected. So that works out for us. But now we need to apply our material on top of this. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to create a new material. And we'll turn off, you probably see reflection, but I've got reflectance right here. I'm going to turn that off for now. We don't need to worry about it. And let's go find our image. So I'm going to go ahead and track down Rust in here as well. Now, here's an important step. Now, I don't actually have to do this, but you might if you have a higher resolution image. I'm going to, now that I've made my image, I'm going to click on the drop down, and I'm going to go to Effects, and I'm going to go to Pixel. And what this will do is pixelate your image. And all you have to do is in this shader, go inside, you see the tile number. And all we have to do is make sure we type in the same number of pixels as the number of subdivisions we put in our plane, which is right here, 400 by 400, 400 by 400. So those should match perfectly. Alrighty, so now let's take this image and throw it onto our hair object, actually. And this is not going to look good right away because it's being mapped UVW. And in fact, I'm not even going to put that on the hair. I'm going to put this on our plane, and I'm going to turn off the hair, so we don't have to worry about that for a second. And now, that's on UVW, but that's no good. We know that's no good. So let's create a flat projection. And now we've created the flat projection. We want to make sure the object's selected and our texture is selected. And now we want to go to our texture tool, and we want to go to, I'm going to full screen this. We got our texture tool, or texture mode rather, and I'm going to turn on axis because it makes it easier to rotate around. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this down so it's flat. I'm going to hit the letter T for scale and scale it up until it's about the size of this. And I don't have to be exact there because now I'm going to click on my material, go to my coordinates tab, and now we can see what numbers we want to be reaching. And you can see that we're really close to 500, so it's actually 500 that we need this to be. Alright, so that should be overlaid. Now, our rotation might not be correct, so that's the only thing. We might need to rotate it to a different angle. So the only way to find that out is to put this back on top of our hair and turn it on. Now, I turn on the hair, I just have to wait a second for it to kind of calculate, and it's going to pop in. Now, we have to see if this looks like it's corresponding properly. I'm going to go back to our object mode, and let's zoom around. And let's see if this feels like it's corresponding properly. It might be kind of hard to judge, actually. I kind of feel like it's not matching. Yeah, you see like this very light area, it's not popping up. If we'd done a different image, this might have been a little easier to figure out. But let's go ahead and... Oh, I know an easy way to figure this out. I'm going to turn the hair back off, and then let's reapply this material. And now that we've applied this material, this is a UV mapping, and the UV mapping is the way that it's extruding it upwards. So we just need to make sure our flat projection matches what this looks like. So now if I throw this material back on here, you're going to see that we weren't correctly matching it. And if I go back to our regular shader view, then we'll be able to tell a little better. So I think we need this corner to be over here. Let's find out. I'm going to pull it off, and there you see it's over here. So I'm going to pull that down. Yep, it seems like that's what we need. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my texture tool, go back to our object, make sure we have the tag selected. I'm going to rotate this there, and let's see if that's correct. It is not, which probably means we have it flipped upside down. So I'm going to flip it 180. Which, after you do this one time, you'll never have to set it again, so that's good. And now we can rotate it here, and now I think we're matching. If I pull it off and pull it back, you'll see that our flat projection is exactly the same as UV. Just make sure you keep rotating until you get that correct. Now I can go ahead, throw that on our hair material, turn it on, and I can actually grab our base plane here. We don't need that anymore. I'm going to turn it off. I'm going to not turn it off here, but I'm going to make it invisible in our render. All right, so we can go back to our object tool. I'm going to turn off axis because we don't need that anymore. And look, we're still getting amazing real-time feedback of our scene here. And now we've got this set up, and that is looking really cool. Look at that. I mean, at this point, I mean, that's the, oops, I accidentally clicked the hair object. If you click the hair object, stuff will run a little slower, and you won't be able to tell what's going on. For the most part, that's it. Like, this is the key part to making this. After this, go ahead and render everything. So I can hit render right now, and you'll see, like, look how quick that renders, because it's a simple setup right now. I'll go into some of the details of things I did in mine to make them look maybe a little bit more sexy. Not specifically my area of expertise, but let's go ahead and tweak a little bit. So here is our material. I'm going to double click on that, and I'm just going to call it main, just so we have it in case I copy it. Okay. So we've got our material, and we can do things like maybe turn on reflection. So I'm going to turn on, I mean, for me it's reflectance, but for you just turn on reflection if you're not in R16. I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to make sure it is nice and reflective. I'm going to set it to, yours will add, I'm going to make sure that mine is brightening as well. Okay, cool. Now I just have a reflective material. Now something that's kind of important, I'm going to go to my render settings, and right now if I hit render, it might take well, not that long, but it might take a little while to render, and that's because we have a lot of reflection depth. And I'm going to set that down to 2. So now if I hit render, it'll take longer than it did before, but it should still be relatively quick, and you see it's reflective. So that's fine. That's kind of cool if you want it to look reflective. It's a little more crystalline looking, perhaps. And then I might want to pull in some sort of HDR to give us reflection. I don't know that I have any good HDR setup. I'm just going to go and find some probably random. Oh, here I've got. Well, that one's not great, but it's something. I'm just going to grab an HDR. You can search for a .HDR on your computer. You'll probably have one somewhere. Nick's the one who knows all the lighting stuff really well. And if I take that and I put it in our sky, and I hit render, then it should just give us something nice to reflect. So now you see we get these really like bright highlights, and that stuff looks pretty cool there. So I mean, an option to do reflection. I don't necessarily like it, so I'm going to turn that off for this render. And well, there's some other things. Well, maybe go to your render settings and turn on Ambient Occlusion. So we know our scale here is actually pretty tiny. Each of these pillars is only, what was it, like 4 units across? So keep that in mind, because right now our dispersion, or our maximum ray length, is 100, and that's really big. So for this, maybe we'll set that down to like 25, and we can just go ahead and hit render and see what this looks like here. But I think we're going to pull down some of the darkness. Like, these get pretty dark. What's great is you really get the depth, you get the layering and how these are all interacting with each other, and you get the spacing in between. So turning on ambient occlusion goes a long way to making this look good. But maybe we don't want this quite black, so I'm going to grab a dark gray and pull this over, and maybe pull our midpoint further over so it ramps up to this gray. So now it should get a little darker, but not overboard. So go ahead and hit render there. So excellent, looks pretty good. And now I'm going to create a light, and we can light this guy up. Now I'm not the best lighter, but we can maybe pull this over. And if we're kind of hanging out in this direction, on this side rather, then let's go ahead and put maybe our main light back here. And let's see, maybe give it a little bit of warmth. And I'm going to turn on a soft shadow. I know Nick likes area, but I'm going to turn on soft. And something that I think is going to be pretty important, I'm going to zoom back up, and this should look not right now because our shadow density isn't thick enough, so it can't do much in the way of shadow. I don't know how well you can tell, but I'm going to crank our shadow map up to the highest default, which is 2000 by 2000, and that should give our light, and of course we could set it as a spotlight and it'll probably render faster, but let's just go ahead and turn that on. And we should start now you can see we're getting some nice little shadow in some of these areas because we have enough resolution in our light to be able to see that. And so this is just one light and some ambient occlusion. That's looking pretty dang good. Lots of depth in there. But there's a lot of things we could do in addition to that. I'm going to create another light, and let's go up to our top, and let's see, maybe we'll push this one over here off to the side, and I'm going to pull it up into the air a little bit, and maybe even higher. And I'm going to maybe make this one not super bright and give it some blue. And I guess if we're doing some sort of 3-point lighting, then we can copy that one. And I'm going to pull it maybe back to a little bit more in the back area. And I don't know, just some other color, maybe some pink over there, because why not? And I'm going to go zoom back up again. And what's really cool, I mean, you saw with some of my renders, like some of the renders I did zoomed out a little bit so you could see the world it's in. And all you have to do is zoom in far enough that you can't see anything on the outskirts. And now you've got this entire world that's, could be infinite as far as anybody else knows. So I hit render, I got these 3 different lights. Only one has shadow. I could turn shadow on in the others if I want to, but this should fill in some of the gaps. So yeah, that's looking pretty nice. And then you have all your normal options as far as texturing. Like you can add your speculars. You can actually, I did some subsurface scattering tests, and it was pretty quick at default settings with subsurface scattering. Now I didn't necessarily like the way the renders looked. I think it's so detailed just with the tiny pillars. Like adding a lot of detail on top of it, I almost feel like it starts taking away from it. So what are some other things I might have been tinkering with? Well, something that I thought was kind of cool was you can make yourself an environment. And when you make the environment object, you can turn on enable fog. And now we're going to start getting some fog showing up here. And there's a couple key settings here. Like we can set the color of the fog. So we get like a blue. We could go really saturated on that. And then we can set our actually our distance is the most important one. So I can start pulling this back. I'll go to half the distance, like 5,000 here. And depending on your scale, it could be different. But now you see it's starting to fade out a lot back there. And this is really important. If you zoom out, your entire island will start fading away. So this fog usually works best when you're really close to some of them and then looking off into the distance. These close ones are barely going to be affected. And you'll see at this angle, they start fading out really nicely in the background. So you got a lot of options as far as playing around with this fog. Everything's going to give you a completely different look. So that's pretty neat. And we could go super strong, like 2,000, maybe even 1,000. Now it's so strong, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily want to do this, and you start pulling the strength down a little bit. But there's some really cool options here, just as along the lines of fog. Let's leave it up really high like that. I'm going to hit render. And once again, I'm rendering this on only my laptop, and look at how fast we're getting these this output. It works so well along these lines. Okay, awesome. What are some other tricks I might have done? I'm going to pull back on this fog. At least I'm going to go up to 5,000. And let's get some quick depth of field going. And of course, that's going to mean using a physical renderer, but I think that's okay. I'm going to create a camera, and this is not my area of expertise. But I'm going to make a camera. I'm going to link to it, and I'm going to create a null object. I'm going to name it target, and it's right in the center. So we should be focusing right around the center. I can even pull it up a little because these pillars will be up. And I'm going to go to my camera, and I'm going to. Actually, I think we have to change it to physical render to even have these options opened up. Oh, no, well, we have focus object here, so we can do that. We can drag our targ into the object tab and into our focus object. So now our camera should be focusing on the focus object. And now to get the good depth of field, of course, we have to go into our physical renderer. Okay, so now we got physical renderer, and I'm actually going to change. What's really great about the setup, well, if we're not doing animation, is we can just go ahead and turn on progressive mode and not worry about any other render settings, except for, of course, turning on depth of field. So now that's on. And now we're going to get really quick renders that'll give us feedback right away. And we don't have to wait a long time. If I hit render, then it's going to kind of calculate for a second. And now you see it goes render, render, render. And it's going to keep improving really quickly. So great way to get really quick feedback. But anyway, now we can go into our camera, go to our physical tab, and our f-stop is the setting that we want. And now we're working at a pretty tiny scale here, But the smaller the number, the more blur we're going to get. So I'm going to drop it down to the lowest number, which might be too much, but I want to get a baseline. So I'm going to drop it down to an f-stop of 1. I'm going to hit render. It's going to calculate a little bit, and it's going to start chugging along. And now we're going to have to wait for it to do a couple passes. And now you're going to start seeing, look, it's pretty blurry over where we are, but it's sharper over there. I'm going to turn off our fog while we're tinkering with this. In fact, I might grab our blue light here and add a shadow as well. And that shadow also needs to get a big shadow map. I'm going to go ahead and hit render on this one. So without our fog and with the extra shadow, we should get a little more depth in here, and that should help us show if areas are focused or not. So a little bit of depth of field definitely goes a long way. To my untrained eye, I might usually go a little bit overboard. But especially if these are like these really tiny things, you're getting all super close, and the depth of field does get pretty... it does get blurry quickly. So we could go beyond 1. We can make it even smaller. So if I were to set this to... Heck, let's go overboard. This is going to be way too much. But I'm going to set our f-stop to 0.1, and let's hit render. And if nothing else, this will illustrate where it's focusing right now. So you see all the stuff up front is super blurry except for this strip back here. So now let's say we don't want to render that strip back there. So I'm going to turn off Y and then pull this closer to us. And it's really important that you kind of rotate your camera around to make sure you have this in the correct spot. Because if I didn't rotate my camera around, this might, perspective-wise, it might have been like way over here, and I wouldn't have realized because it's been up in the air. But that's focusing there. Now we're still got the crazy high the crazy low f-stop, so it's still gonna be super blurry, but at least we can see where we're giving our focal point. And that looks actually pretty good as far as like where it's focusing. So now all we have to do is go back to our camera and be reasonable about what we're doing. I'm gonna say maybe 0.8 because just a little stronger than the 1 was giving us. Hit render, let it chug a little bit. There we go. Now it's definitely pulling our focus here. And the longer I let this sit here, the more passes it's rendering. And you see how dang fast this is going. I haven't even tried playing with GI, but I imagine that would be relatively reasonable as well. You see that our focus is being pulled to this little area, almost like a city in the forest. So yeah, that's looking awesome. What's another trick I might have done? I did some water in some of the renders. Let's just talk about that real quick. I'm going to set this size up to 1000 by 1000 on this cube, and I'm going to pull this cube down. As I pull it down, think of this as the level of the water. So the way this render is set up, the way this background is, this could be like a swampy area. So that's fine right there. I pull it down. Let's make a new water material. We'll call it water. We'll open it up, and we'll do this really quick. We don't need a color channel. We do need transparency, and I think water is 1.55. So now we got our transparency, and then we could turn on reflectance and get some, and of course, you know, if you're in R15, you got to do R15 stuff. But in reflectance, I'm going to go ahead and add a new Beckman layer, I guess. There might be better ones, but I'm going to add that, and I'm going to go to my Fresnel, and I'm going to add a, I think a dielectric, and go to water, and that should give us a good Fresnel on that. And let's go ahead and throw that on the cube. And actually, well, we can go ahead and hit render that and see how that looks. Oh, look at that. That's looking pretty sexy already. I tend to find that if you have physical render on or not, it makes a big difference on this. And that looks so cool. I actually want more of it. I'm going to pull this up higher so we get even more swamp. And another thing I'm going to do is go to our transparency, and I'm going to add some absorption distance. So what color should our swamp be? I think it should be kind of a boggy, ucky yellow. So yeah, there we go. So this should be pretty heavy color. Our absorption distance is important. Now remember, our scale is really tiny, so I'm going to set this to maybe 25. So as it gets to 25, we'd have full color. So anyway, when I hit render now, the deeper areas should look more and more green. So yeah, there we got this. And if you set a really tiny absorption distance, in fact, why don't we make it look like muddy water? I'm going to go to like a brown. And let's set our absorption distance to something tiny like 5. And now it should get really murky really quickly. And that now look, we can barely see through it at all. So our absorption distance does a lot. Actually, that's looking pretty cool. So why don't we set our absorption distance to something like 15, so we get a little bit of depth, but not too much. Render again, and now you can start seeing like these plunge into the water a little bit, but mostly we're getting reflection out, and that's pretty cool. Maybe there's a little too much water, so I'll pull this back down again, get a little more of these guys poking their heads up above. Just break it up a little bit more. There we go. Totally a swampy looking thing. Now keep in mind our source material here. All this is a photo of a rusty pole, and look at what we're getting out of it. For the most part, those are all the tricks I wanted to talk about. Really quickly, I guess we can swap this out to a different image. I'm going to turn off our cube, and I'm going to hide our environment. And let's just put a different image in here real quick. And then keep in mind, you can throw in an animation. Very, very important thing. If you put an animation in here and you want to have it render, you know how when we like turn off the hair and turn it back on, and it takes a long time for it to kind of be like, and I'm on. If you put an animation in there, it's going to take that long to figure out every time you change a frame. So if you put it in here, don't hit play. If you hit play, it'll probably just freeze cinema. You'll never be able to escape out of it. It'll probably calculate and then, a minute later, pop to the next frame, but then it'll start playing the next frame. So don't hit play. But you totally could put an animation here. Just make sure you render it to the picture viewer, not in the viewport. Okay, anyway, let's go to our hair, and we'll go to our thickness, and let's find a different image. We'll just grab one of the other ones I did. We could do cereal. We could do winter. This one looked pretty weird. Look at the cereal. I'm going to open this up, and we can just actually copy this image, and now we go to our color as well. Go inside the pixel, and now we'll paste it here inside the pixel. So now it's pixelating this, and boom, it's already refreshed for us, and now we've got Cereal World. So now if you go down here, this one's got like a cool Grand Canyon vibe going on. Look at these rich colors we're getting. Excuse me. But what's crazy is if we actually start zooming up to the top, and I start zooming out, look at that. It's cereal. So there's probably some cool renders you could do along those lines, where it's like, oh wow, we got this crazy environment, and you're doing... And obviously, we're getting really good feedback here, so you can do like a camera fly through, and it's like, and you're flying through and past all these pillars, and at the end, you kind of zoom down and then zoom out, and then it's like, oh, it's breakfast cereal. That's crazy. In addition to that, there's a lot of things to play with as far as hair. Like, this didn't necessarily have to be on a plane. Like, this could be a deformed object. This could have been on a sphere. You'll lose your imagery, of course, if you do it on a sphere. But this is still hair. If we go into our hair, I can go to something like frizz. I can turn on our frizz, and this is going to make our thing frizzy. Look at that. All these pillars randomly rotate to different directions. You're kind of, it breaks the illusion a little bit, but all of these are options here. The thicknesses, we have tons of options along those lines. We have different scale we can vary. Now, the color stuff doesn't matter, but how it's the orientation and whatnot, that does matter. Another thing that's important is we've only been working with these squares, these pillars right now. But if we go to the hair, we can go to our generate, and instead of it being a square, I can say go to circle. Now, circle has more geometry. Instead of it being 5 polygons, I think it's 24. But boom, look how quick that was. Now we got these pillars, and it's going to be a little slower, but look, we're still getting amazing feedback, and now we've got these pillars instead. These pillars could be bigger. They could be, and then start intersecting each other. They could be smaller. What else do we have here? Well, we have flat. I don't know what that is. Probably just be a line. Then we have a triangle, so you can get these like prisms going. I'll let that. Yeah, so we get these prisms, and now you see we get these prisms. But this might be a little boring because they're all facing the same direction. Well, we can fix that easily by going from align free to random. And now let this figure out itself for a second, and then boom, each of these is randomly rotated. So you get all these pillars facing whatever direction you want. I'm going to deselect, and there we go. That's looking pretty great too. And then you'd have to be careful. You want to be very careful, but you can also go to spline, and you can feed it whatever, actually not spline, I think sweep. If you go to sweep, you can feed it in your own spline to get custom shapes that way. And then you gotta be really careful, but you can actually turn on instance, and instance would allow you to feed it a model. And actually, I did a test, and it worked really quickly. It was still working well, giving me good feedback, but there's important things to note, like I'll just do this example. I'm not going to actually put it in there, but let's say we wanted this 6-sided shape. So I'm going to go ahead and fly down the ground. I'm going to create an extrude. I'm going to throw this into the extrude. I'm going to tell it to extrude upward. So I'm going to pull it up. So this becomes our base object. And then let's say I'm like, oh, I want to add a cap. So I want the end cap to have a fillet. So I say cap there, and we get this cap on there. It's like, okay, cool. Now, if I just feed this object into it, it would work, but it would run really slow, and it would run really slow because if I make this editable, which is what would be essentially happening, you see that we've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4 objects. So for every pillar, there'd be 4 objects. In addition to there being 4 objects, we have 1, 2, 3 selection tags. And I found that Cinema, these selection tags slow down Cinema as much as an object does. So what I would do with this is actually this bottom cap, we don't even need it, so I would delete that out. And I grab these 3 pieces, and I'd right-click and say connect and delete. And then we don't need those selection tags, unless for some reason you did. And then this UV tag, we don't need that. And the Fong, depending on what we're doing with it, I mean, if your shape calls for it, then use it. But otherwise, delete it. You don't need that either. And now this is the object we should throw in as an instance. So you want to make sure you clean it up and have as low poly as possible, as few objects as possible. I mean, technically, we'd be able to throw anything in here. We could throw a city in here. We could throw flowers in here. But there'd be a lot of polygons. And at 400 by 400... I would expect Cinema to go really slow at that point. But this feedback is unbelievable, especially compared to, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, like, you make a cloner and you make one too many clones and it starts running really slow. Getting this kind of feedback is absolutely amazing out of Cinema. So I think I'm going to swap this back to our swamp. And this is, and I think I talked about everything I want to. In some of the renders you might have seen, I did I'm not going to talk my way through the whole thing, but how well can you see it? I have like a visible fog floating around here. Actually, I guess you can see it best here. And I'll just mention the way I did it. Especially when we go back here, you see we get this really nice fog floating around. And actually, this fog is just a visible light. And I went to the noise tab and I added noise to it. So, and then I have a fall off. So there's actually a square spotlight facing upward, and it fades out as it goes out. And I get this awesome cloud. And you turn on no illumination, and boom, you got fog. Like these awesome wisps. In fact, you can even animate those. I didn't, but you can animate them. So, yeah, I think that does it. I hope you guys have as much fun playing with this as I have. I'm sure I'm going to be making even more renders and posting the rest of these. But yeah, I had a lot of fun. And I'm going to set this up because Nick might tinker with this one, actually. But I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Hopefully it'll be half as fun as this one. So, see you then. Bye.